White Rocket Entertainment podcast number 955. As Andy says, that's a lot of podcasts. Hello and welcome to the White Rocket podcast. It's one long conversation with a variety of guests about the best in popular culture. I am your host, Van Allen Plexico, here in 2026 as we begin our 14th, I believe. I'm not going to do the math live on the air. Our 14th year of White Rocket Entertainment podcasts. The White Rocket podcast, the White Rocket Babylon 5 and Sci-Fi Review podcast, the AU Wishbone, and of course, On Her Majesty's Secret podcast. I thought that for my upcoming birthday in a few days, I would do something that really is controversial and radical. You're not supposed to do. I've written or co-written a lot of books. You can find them on Amazon.com. You can find them through bookstores. You can go to www.plexico.net. But today I'm going to do the one thing a writer is never supposed to do. I'm going to choose some favorites. Oh, it's controversial in the writing world. Not supposed to love all your children equally, right? Not supposed to favor one over the other. But I have to be honest, right? Especially on my birthday, I have to be honest. And it'll be fun. But I mean, I have to be honest that there are, a handful of books that I look back on and I say, let me put it this way. I have, as of this recording, beginning of 2026, I have 22 novels in print and about close to 10 nonfiction books, along with various anthologies and, this, that, and the other. But 22 novels and 10 nonfiction books is a fair way to put it. I think they're all good because I wrote them and because I feel like I wrote them to the best of my abilities at the time I was writing them, right? In other words, I did the best I could. I feel good about them. I wouldn't take any of them back. And with a couple of exceptions, I don't like to go back and meddle with them like I'm George Lucas fooling around with Star Wars, years later. I pretty much like to, put them out there and say, this is where my writing was. This is where my head was. This is what I was thinking at the time I wrote it. And that's over a period of some 20 something years now. So, but this is going to be a quick and dirty look at four of my books, four of those 32 roughly books that, in my opinion, exceeded my expectations, that actually surprised me when they were done. I'm like, oh, hey, look at me. I did pretty good there. They're the ones I can still pick up and hold in my hand and kind of just shake my head in surprise and go, yeah, these really came out nice. Even they didn't just meet my expectations, they exceeded them. And then I'm going to tell you for each one why I think that. I'm only going to do four, so we won't be here for a really long time, but I'm just going to tell you the four books I wrote and in different times, in different years, and why I think they really came out maybe better than I expected and kind of left me shocked, kind of surprised. And, now, note that it's funny. Let me back up. It's funny. I've won quite a few awards for my writing, but these four books together have only won one award. So maybe my opinions differ from those of the readers, the audience, and the reading public and all that. And that's okay. The first goal of a writer should be to please him or herself. And then you hope that other people also get it and appreciate it and like it. But you're first trying to please yourself. Now, I'm going to be doing this. I had this little part written down so I can get all this in. The rest of this, no notes off the top of my head. So this should be interesting. Let's see what I pull out of nowhere off the top of my head. Let's get going. Here we go. All right. So first up, as you can see on your screen now, is Miami Heist. Now, it's interesting that at least two of these books of the four are the second book in a series. And it may be that, a writer gets their legs under them with the first book And then with the second book, they go in having a more of a command of the material. They know the characters better than they did at the beginning of the first book. And they've got a sense of how things work better. That may very well be true. I don't know. Probably. But this one really did absolutely surprise me. I wrote Vegas Heist, the first book in the series, in 2018. Wasn't even sure at that time I was going to write any more books in this setting with these characters. These are my 1960s heist caper novels, meaning they're a crime story, but they have a sort of a humor and a wacky edge to them, kind of like Ocean's 11, or the Parker books from Donald Westlake, Richard Stark, or Dortmunder. They're supposed to have an element of fun, that you root for the bad guys, quote unquote. And I felt like the first one, set in 1965, Vegas Heist, did that. And I was really afraid to tarnish its legacy by doing a subpar sequel. But Miami Heist really did surprise me. It came out way better than I expected. It won an award. It got the Imagine Award from the Imaginarium Convention in Louisville, Kentucky in 2020 or 2021 when they gave the award for Best Thriller of the Year. And I'm so proud of that and pleased. And just very quickly why I think this one works. I knew I wanted to have my heisting duo of Harper and Salsa rob something in Miami. But two things happened while I was writing this book. And this one I wrote during the pandemic, basically on my iPad out in the hammock in the front yard. So it was very fun to write in every sense of the word. But two things happened in particular. One, I did a lot of research on mid-60s Miami before I started writing it. I had maps. I had pages of notes of things that happened. Things like the Miami Dolphins started up. So there's a football team. There was a hurricane that hit. A lot of things along that. There was an island off the coast, Fisher Island, that a lot of wealthy people had houses on, and I made a fictionalized version of that for the book. So it was just doing all the research gave me a lot more avenues for the plot to go in than I had originally come up with, just sitting there cold thinking, what are they going to rob in Miami? This is where research, even for a fiction book, can really come in handy, because it can suggest a lot of things you might not have ever thought of on your own. And the hurricane became a huge part of this book because it was real. The other thing that happened was I had I thought was a pretty solid ending in mind. And, I lay out an outline, a synopsis when I start writing. I had that in mind. But what ended up happening was, as I was getting into the last quarter of the book, writing it, things started occurring to me that were just suggested by the things that had already happened, right? Things that I didn't know when I started, when I was outlining the story, informed the ending. And so I just sat back almost, it's the old story where the writer says somebody was standing over my shoulder whispering in my ear. And I'm like, oh, hey, that's a good idea. And it's kind of a schizophrenic thing that writers do, is that we have voices in our head. We really do. These characters and the plot starts talking to us. And so as I was writing the final act and laying it out, I thought, well, what if this happens? What if this happens? Like, I'd added the hurricane had become important. And then I started saying, well, wait a minute. If there's a hurricane, the army might be down there with military trucks. So we'll have Harper and Salsa's truck where they're trying to escape with the goods be a military truck. They can blend right in. That's cool. See? And then I said, well, but there's a lot of mud because there's all this downpour of rain and wind and storm. So now they're going to have a problem with the traction, with getting through the mud and getting from the beach and all that. And it's like, all these things started adding up. Plus, I got to know my security guard character that was kind of their antagonist in the story. And I thought, what if he starts taking advantage of this? So the ending of this book just opens up in ways that I had not expected and made it truly a delight. And so I think this is the one book I can think of that people have said, this was better than the first book, that it really did exceed everybody's expectations. And so I'm really excited about that, especially since I'm currently working on the third book, the sequel, the third book in this in this series with co-author Alan J. Porter, which will be hopefully out in 2026, called Monaco Heist, where the guys go over to Monaco and get involved in a Formula One race trying to steal something there. Maybe it's the cars, maybe it's not the cars. You'll find out hopefully pretty soon. All right, so that's Miami Heist. Next up on the list, number 2, in no particular order, is Alpha Omega. Now, some of you, I've gotten a lot of good reviews on this book. A lot of people really read it and loved it. Haven't gotten any bad reviews so far, thank goodness. Always appreciate that. What made this one exceed my expectations? It took me 19 years to write this to a point that I was happy with it. And it's so weird how, I'm gonna go ahead and say this part while I'm thinking about it. One of the things about writing a book is knowing where the story should start, right? There's always going to be stuff that happened before the book starts, the backstory. And then there's the events that happen during the story, and then the things that maybe happen after, depending. And what you have to do as a writer is figure out what part of that great long lifelong story you want to include in the book. What becomes backstory, what becomes later, maybe a sequel, maybe just never go there. What part do you actually cover in play-by-play detail, right? And this book originally started at a point that is now the middle of the book. I wrote what I thought was the final version of it in 2019, and it was published by Pro Se Press, which was awesome. And it kept nagging me. I kept thinking, you know, I'm glad it's out there and I'm glad it's been published and it's selling and all, but I feel like it doesn't, I think I missed where the story starts. And, you know, that's very much of an instinctual thing. There's no rule to it, really. I think you just, as a writer, when you know your characters and know your story, then it will tell you where it should start. And in all my other novels, I knew exactly where they started and had no problem. But with this one, I thought, you know, I think I started too late in the story. I think there's more fun, good, interesting, and character stuff that needs to be in there before we get to the part I wrote. So after a few years, I got the rights to the book back, and I started backing up. And I said, well, you know what? I'm going to start it here. Well, you know, no, I'm going to back it up even further. Well, you know, and I just kept backing up and backing up. And so I was joking with people online when I was writing it, saying I was trying to write a prologue to the 2019 novel, and I've ended up, the prologue is longer than the novel. And at that point, I understood this is really 2 books. There's the book where everything happens that gets my main characters up to, they're on their way to the situation, right? Trying not to give spoilers here. And then the book that I'd written in 2019 is pretty much, then they're there and you have the whole conflict leading to the conclusion. But both of them kind of have a rising action and a big set piece action scene, and then, you know, stop. And so it works as like one giant book that's book 1 and book 2, and it works as 2 separate books. So I ended up publishing it as one giant book just because I wanted one time in my life to publish an 800-page novel. And it's about an 800-page novel, which I'm very proud of. But it could just as easily be 2 400-page novels, and I have some ideas for another 400-page novel that could be the third one. So anyway, we'll see. That's all in the future. But yeah, this is one that was just such a big story, so sprawling, and I had a hard time getting a handle on where it stopped and where it started. And then the thing that made this book exceed my expectations is 2 things. One, it's a really happy thing when you can just pick a book up, open it to any page, and start reading and go, oh, that's cool. Hey, that's a cool thing. Oh, I like that sentence. That's a very well-turned sentence. And honestly, and again, in all modesty aside on this episode, I'm not being modest. I'm just telling you how I feel inside. I can open Alpha Omega up to any page pretty much and be very happy with what's there. I can, it's not 800 pages of let's just slog through to the ending. No. I think every page is good. And for a writer to say, I think every page in an 800-page book is good, that's a very good feeling. It's a satisfying, very satisfying feeling. So that is what made this one really special to me. The other really kind of funny thing at the end that I'll share is when I got the first half, the new half finished, the first 400 pages now, and sort of attached that on to the other 400 pages, my thinking was, now I'm going to have to go through and rewrite the whole thing at once, because there's no way it's going to be smooth, right? I've taken a book that was written in 2019, done some revisions and improvements to it, and then added a whole nother book to the beginning of it so that it's 400 and 400, 800 pages total. So there's no way that's a smooth thing. It's going to take massive work. I was prepared to spend another 3 to 6 months on it. And I started reading through it, just making some cosmetic changes here and there. And I got to the place that I thought would be a bump, where you change different gauges of railroad track metaphorically, or go from a dirt road to a highway or something. And it was smooth as glass, the whole thing. I couldn't believe it. So I can't credit my conscious self for that, because my conscious self was sure that wasn't going to happen. All I can think is that subconsciously I was spinning those plates and I got them all spun. I don't know. So again, my point here is these are books that exceeded my expectations, and getting to that joint between the two 400-page books and having it just fit together like a puzzle piece and required like a week's proofreading work was astonishing to me. So there's my number 2, in no particular order, books that have pleased me somehow that I wrote. Number 3, let's move right along. Baranak. Now, this is one of my least popular books in terms of sales and reviews and stuff. And that's kind of sad and depressing to me. But I said a minute ago that your first audience is yourself, right? You want to please yourself. And then you kind of have to hope that if it pleased you, it'll please other people too. And so Baranak is the second, once again, it's a second book, just like Miami Heist was. Baranak, this is a sort of a fantasy sci-fi mashup series. It's my sort of Roger Zelazny, little bit of sci-fi, little bit of fantasy. I like to compare it to like Jack Kirby or Jim Starlin's comics, where it's kind of science fiction, but there's also sort of this, these gods, like the Asgardian gods, maybe, that Jack Kirby would use, or like Thanos, like Jim Starlin would use. These beings that are almost like mythological gods, but they're also science fictional super beings. The characters in the Warhammer 40,000 stories are kind of like that, where they kind of straddle that line between science fiction characters and mythological fantasy characters. And I enjoy bringing those two types of story and characters together. In fact, when the first book in this series is called Lucian Dark God's Homecoming, and the first publisher I ever sent it to, they sent it back, the paper manuscript, and they turned it down, though they sent me a letter with it that said, I have a feeling I'm going to regret turning this one down, and I hope that they do. But the manuscript that came back, you could tell the pages were ruffled, all the fantasy part. But see, one of the things I like to make is surprising. There's a moment in Lucian where they go and get in a spaceship. And that's when you realize this is not just a fantasy story, it's fantasy characters in a science fiction universe. And you could see that was where the page ruffling stopped. It's like the editor that was reading it. And I get it. I understand. The editor was reading it. It's like, I'm reading a fantasy novel. Wait, they just got in a spaceship. No, their thinking probably is, I cannot market this. If I'm a big publishing company, I don't know how to sell this. I don't know what section it goes in. But I wanted to write what made me happy. And so I wrote it that way. Baranak, now that you kind of understand what these books are, Baranak is the sequel. Lucian was from the point of view of the god of evil, kind of the Loki character, the god of mischief. Baranak in that book is the main villain for much of the book. He's a big, blonde-headed war god that is trying to basically keep his brother god, the Loki. It's like Thor and Loki almost, although I would point out I wrote these books before those movies came out. At least the first one. Yeah, the Lucian by far, way before the movies. But Baranak in this book, it's from his point of view, first person point of view. And a number of people that really like Lucian don't read Baranak, and they'll tell me, "Oh, I don't want to read that one." I'm like, "Well, why not? I thought you liked Lucian." "Oh yeah, but I didn't like Baranak. I don't want to read his book." And I'm like, "But that's the point. In Lucian's story, Lucian is the hero and Baranak is the villain. But in this book, it's from Baranak's point of view, and you'll like him. I promise. He's a fun guy when he's not being, vilified by the main character of the other book." So in this one, Baranak is younger. And it's kind of the origin story for that universe. And the thing that exceeded my expectations about this one is that it just kept turning corners I wasn't expecting. I'm very conscientious about having an outline, of having a story synopsis, of knowing exactly where I'm going. See, I always say, I can't stand to write when I don't know where the story is going. I know that most of my brother and sister writers, and especially pulp writers, they say it's boring if I know where the story is going. I want to sit down and write, seat of the pants, as we say, not knowing where it's going. But I'm a very different writer from that. I totally get that. I understand the impulse to not want to know where the story is going when you're writing it, because it could make you bored. But understand, I think, I don't want to speak for them, but my guess is that for writers like that, they get their enjoyment from what happens in the story, and they like to discover it as they're writing. Fair enough. There's many that are very good at that. That's not me. I get my enjoyment actually sitting down and typing the story, crafting the sentences, crafting the dialogue, putting the musicality, the sort of prose poetry into it. 90% of my brain when I'm writing a draft is, what does it sound like? How is it laid out? How are the sentences and the paragraphs structured? That's what I'm aiming for, is to craft a story that way. I need the roadmap already in place. If I'm having to navigate and do all that stuff, no. See, for me, it's like building a house. I need the blueprints done before I start hammering boards. To me, trying to hammer and sand and paint while I'm making up the blueprint as I go along, I could not do that. I just couldn't do it. So Baranak had a blueprint, but it did not last very long. More than probably any other book I've ever written, this book started turning corners. And they end up on horses. I have a fantasy godlike character and an alien riding horses like it's the Old West, which I did not see coming. And it works. A lot of riding on horseback in this book. Also has space battles. It's, and then of course, another thing about it is, at the end, you find out who Baranak is telling the story to, because it's from first person point of view. An example of this is the great writer Gene Wolfe, the science fiction writer Gene Wolfe. I was reading his Long Sun series, 4 books called the Book of the Long Sun. He wrote the Book of the New Sun, but I love the Book of the Long Sun that came later. In one of the Long Sun books, this whole time you thought it was third person. And all of a sudden he says, and that's when you and I did whatever. And you realize this is not in third person. He's just been saying everything in third person. It's actually one of the characters telling you and speaking to another character. And that just, I fell out of my chair pretty much, realizing that I'd been manipulated that way by the way it was written. It was brilliant. And that was in like the third of the 4 books. So it gets way into the story. So I said, all right, I'm going to end this book where you find out who he's talking to. And you do. And that was a lot of fun. So there are other things about this book that really make me happy. There's a lot of Zelazny in this one, probably even more than Lucian. I put a lot of my Zelazny love into it. So there's like smart alecky monsters that you have that the main character might have an argument with in a dark cave, perhaps. That's very, very fun. There's some really phantasmagorical imagery, horrific, like there's a scene where they cut off a creature's head and then try to use science and technology and magic to read the brain of the creature that's dead now and reanimate it and stuff. And that's kind of outside of my usual ballpark. But this is at heart, this is a book about 7 aliens who try to make themselves into gods by tapping into this raw energy. And Baranak is the son of a space army general who ends up getting caught up in it and has to try to stop them, along with a very untrustworthy alien who helps him. So the 2 of them against these 7 super powerful beings. Again, there's a lot of the courts of chaos in this book, a lot of Amber in this book. If you like the Chronicles of Amber, I think you'll really like Lucian, Baranak, and Caroline. So that's what I really love about Baranak. There's other things too. I like the cover by Mark Williams. All right, last stop, and this is my nonfiction book on here, co-written with John Ringer. This is First Time Ever, the untold story of how Auburn first brought undefeated Alabama to Jordan-Hare Stadium and beat them. So this is a nonfiction sports book, but the reason I include it, and it's the only one that has a co-author with John, the reason I include this book is that because when John and I were working on this book, and he was out rounding up interviews, finding cool people that we should talk to and everything, and coming up with questions to ask them and all that. Meanwhile, my share of the early work was doing a lot of historical research on how this all played out. And again, this is about how books exceeded your expectations going in. This book, to me, originally this book was going to be about the 1989 Alabama-Auburn Iron Bowl in Auburn, the first time Alabama played Auburn in Auburn. And it was a tremendously historical and emotional moment for people like John and me. And so I thought, we're going to talk about the game. We're going to go play by play. We're going to talk about the pregame, the postgame, and all that. But what I quickly realized doing the historical research for this book is what I realized was you cannot tell the story of how important 1989 was if you don't explain to the reader the series itself, Auburn and Alabama, the Iron Bowl, the rivalry. And to do that, I had to keep backing up because every time I would back up a few years to find a place to start, I would find Alabama up to shenanigans again. And I'm like, oh, they're still doing it. So I'd back up again. And I backed up all the way to 1893, the first time the 2 programs played each other. And when we started the book there, it became a book about the history of the Iron Bowl from 1893 to 1989. Again, I was not expecting to write a history of the Iron Bowl for almost a century. But that's what it had to be, right? Because to understand why Alabama wouldn't come to Auburn before 1989 and to understand why Auburn cared about that, you had to understand what Alabama had been doing and how Auburn had responded to it for all those years. So even a nonfiction book can surprise you in terms of, what you end up including and where to begin. Again, it's like with Alpha Omega, it's another case of having to figure out where does the story start and finding out the story actually starts a lot earlier than you thought it would going in. And writing nonfiction is different. I don't do a huge outline. I just kind of lay out almost like the chapter titles. I lay out the chapters and say, we need to hit this, we need to hit this, we need to do this, right? And so this one just kept getting longer as we moved. But it's cool because you find out, as they say, there's nothing new under the sun. Alabama being jerks in 1989, they were being jerks in 1893. So as much as this book is about the 1989 Iron Bowl, and it's also the story of how Alabama football has been jerks to Auburn for as long as there's been Auburn and Alabama football. And that was a very, very fun thing to discover. And it was really fun to dig into all that and to shatter a few myths that have developed over the years, like, Why did they play in Birmingham for so long? There's always, and why did they start playing each other again? Didn't the state legislature get involved? And the answer is kind of a yes and no. There's a lot of stuff that you can find out if you dig far enough and dig deep enough. And so we put it all in there. So, all right, those are the 4 books. I'm going to wrap it up there. Those are the 4 books that surprised me the most after the fact, where I said, these were better than I even hoped they were going to be. I hope you'll forgive my immodesty, but I think folks that know me know I'm a harsh enough critic of myself normally that when I say something I did came out pretty good, I'm surprised and very excited about that. And I'm honest. I'm completely honest. I could do 4 more books that disappointed me, but I'm not going to tell you which ones they are because I want you to read them, and you may not be disappointed, and you may not love these as much as I do or as much as John does, but I think you'll really enjoy these. So again, www.amazon.com has them all. You can go to plexico.net and see all my books, podcasts, everything there. Find links to them, descriptions. And then bookstores can get them in. They don't, bookstores only carry a tiny fraction of all the books that are out there. And I doubt any, there's bookstores in Auburn and maybe Montgomery and Birmingham that have like the Auburn books like this. But otherwise, you can ask them to order them for you if you want to. This has been my little fun happy birthday to me show. I hope you enjoyed it. And I'll see you guys on our next podcast down the road. Take it easy.